All looks good. So we now have over 80 in. Well, welcome all. I'm Gordon McBain. I'm with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction and also Western University. Used to be Biological Service or the Atmospheric Environment Service, and worked with Linda and many others, I suspect, on this call at that time. I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker. Say that Linda Mortsch is a leading world expert in adaptation and impacts research, vulnerability of societies and everything, and she'll be talking about the Climate Change 2022 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. I think this is a very important topic and very relevant now. You can see the first slide on the screen is the key findings relevant to the Canadian context. Linda's been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change literally since it was started in 1990 when we wrote the first report. She played a role in others. By 2007, she was the coordinating lead author for the North America chapter. I was the review editor and was impressed with what I saw of all the great work the authors had done. For the 2014 AR5 report, she was the review editor for the North American chapter, and Paul Kovacs, who's on this call, was one of the lead authors. And for this report, she is one of the three coordinating lead authors for the North American chapter and played a whole role overseeing in terms of the report that has just come out very recently. So today we're very pleased to have an opportunity to listen and to ask questions. And let me tell you that first of all, for questions, we ask you to put your questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You're looking at Zoom, not the chat box, but into the Q&A box. And we'll bring those questions together. Paul Kovacs will be handling the Q&A discussions at the end with Linda. And so if you enter your questions into the question and answer box, then we will address them at the end of Linda's presentation. So with that, I'm very pleased now to invite Linda Mortsch to make her presentation, and hand it over to you, Linda. Thank you very much for making this presentation. I know it will be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And thank you, Paul, both of you, for inviting me to give everyone a briefing on what we accomplished and some of the key findings from the most recently released IPCC Assessment Report. So today I'm going to try and give you, address three key areas. First of all, just to give the audience and give you an idea of the background on what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is, so you can understand what it is trying to accomplish and the significance of the report that was released on February 28th. I'll also highlight some key messages and what's new from the summary for policymakers that sort of integrates all of the information across all of the chapters of the assessment report. But most importantly, I'd like to share with you some of the key findings relevant to the Canadian context from the North American chapter. And I'll try and address three key areas. First of all, give you a sense of what's new, and certainly the issue and the information and the complexity of everything that's addressed in this particular series. This sixth assessment report is definitely a lot more complex, and there are some new findings that I'd like to share with you. I'd like to also give you two case study examples just to sort of provide a narrative and how some of the ideas of vulnerability, impacts, adaptation tie together, and give you a sort of a picture, a narrative, and then to focus quite significantly on some ideas on adaptation. So first of all, what is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? And it's portrayed, and its goal is to provide and to be the authoritative international scientific body on climate change. And it was established in 1980 and 89, and it sort of provides assessments. Its goal is to provide a state of knowledge of climate change and also to provide the scientific basis of climate change. So that's the global climate modeling, the trends, the detection, attribution, the impacts and future risks and options for adaptation, and also mitigation. And the content of these assessment reports are to inform countries in their negotiations on the Framework Convention on Climate Change. These reports and also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is organized around 3 key working groups. Working Group 1, which is the physical science basis, and the report for the 6th assessment process was released in August of 2021. The Working Group 2, which we're going to cover today, is Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and it was released February 28th of this year. And Working Group 3, which addresses mitigation, will be released coming April of this year. The IPCC undergoes a very rigorous process. And at present, there are about 195 members in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, member countries. And they decide on the scope and the timing of these IPCC assessments to inform their negotiations. And as part of this whole process, hundreds, and for this assessment report for Working Group 2, I believe there were 260 authors that were nominated by their countries, and then their participation and was finalized by the IPCC. We volunteer our time and our expertise, and we are given an outline, a chapter outline and a whole report outline that is devised or developed and ratified by countries. So we have an outline that we are expected to follow. Our role and our job is to review hundreds of journal articles, reports, and assess that knowledge, synthesize it, and present it in a form that follows that table of contents or that outline to provide information to these countries. And we undergo multiple stages of review, 3 often, 2 for sure. And when Gordon and Paul helped with the 4th assessment report, we had 1,600 comments for our chapter when we had governments and experts review. This time we had about 1,200, so not as many. Our charge is to provide information that is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So what our role is to lay out for the governments of the world their options and the consequences of some of the actions, but not to tell countries what should be done. And in the assessment process, there are a number of products that are produced. So for example, for Working Group 2, there's the Summary for Policymakers, the SPM, which is about 10 to 20 pages, a technical summary, which is still a bit of a synthesis of some of the key technical material, and then the full assessment report. I think this time around, it's like thousands of pages long. What is important for people to note is that the summary for policymakers is approved by the member countries at this time, 195 countries. And each word, each line, and the whole summary for policymakers undergoes a review process by the countries, and there must be unanimous agreement. So There is no, so the words reflect a unanimous agreement of all the countries of the world. So then the next slide that I'm going to show you is the key working group 2 summary statement. It sort of is the synthesis, the chapeau of what we're saying here. And this is very, very important. And this is where I think it's important for people to understand just how important this statement is, because it reflects a unanimous statement for all of the countries of the world, and that they understand and they know the severity and consequences of what they're saying and what the issue is. So I'm just going to say it to you, read it to you, because I think it's really important that people take this in and hear it. So the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. So that means without a doubt, there's a serious threat. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And that statement is has a very high confidence associated with it. And so there's a number of key ideas that is brought forward here is unequivocal. Of course, I've mentioned that. The whole framing in terms of an urgent need for action on adaptation and mitigation together, that we be anticipatory rather than reactive, and that we have a limited time before we reach the 1.5 degrees C threshold, where the risks and impacts become progressively more severe, and this will affect our quality of life. And also there's the consideration and the message that we need to think about having a sustainable future or sustainable development as we go forward. Just to sort of highlight to people what's important, what's new and important. One of the interesting ideas or results that came out was we've talked about or heard about the climate attribution. Now, there was some effort and some success at identifying and doing some attribution of the impact of climate change on impacts. So for example, an increase in area burned by wildfire in Western United States. The other idea, and it's important to think about this, is the consequences of multiple hazards interacting together and causing cascading effects throughout regions and sectors. The other key idea is that we're documenting that there are some impacts approaching irreversibility. For example, water availability from retreating glaciers and loss of species. Another key idea that emerged was that we've talked about the physical health of people being affected by climate change. However, there's growing information with respect to mental health effects and the trauma caused by extreme weather events and the associated loss of livelihoods and culture, and by concerns about the future stability of society in a hotter world. That was the mental health effects was one of the key new pieces of information. The SPM also called for solutions, adaptation solutions that would incorporate the idea of social justice and equity, and considering those vulnerable, most vulnerable populations and including them in the decision-making with respect to adaptation. For me, I think one of the most key ideas also is the contrast and the need comparison between transformational versus incremental adaptation. Incremental adaptation is where we make small changes and evolve over time. Transformational change acknowledges that there has to be sweeping changes with respect to social, economic, environmental systems, and reorganizing the way we undertake the way we do our business on this earth. Three ideas that came out of that is that there seems to be, and there was, a very strong push for nature as an untapped potential resource for adaptation, and recognition that we have to address and use more nature-based solutions as part of our adaptation strategies. An interesting idea that came out of the fifth assessment report was the idea and the dialogue that began on solution space. And it really became evident that there is a growing need for us to think about solution space. We seem to be very effective at defining the problem, i.e., what's the climate going to be looking like? What's our vulnerability? Where's our exposure? But we really need to spend more time thinking about the solution space, how we come up with solutions, how we might evolve those solutions in the future through incremental changes as well as transformational changes. Another key idea was that adaptation is underfunded. This is definitely from a developing country perspective, but I would also argue within the North American context it's a continuing issue. I'd just like to leave you with the final sort of highlighted yellow statement from what's new. And this is sort of the overarching idea with respect to adaptation that I think we should take away and should be very, very aware of. And I'll read it to you. It's that adaptation measures reduce risks from climate impacts, but efforts will be overwhelmed by increasingly extreme weather events unless combined with aggressive mitigation efforts to curb global warming. So there's the message that adaptation is extremely important, but it must also be aligned with successful and aggressive mitigation efforts. Next, I'd like to move into giving you an overview of the North America chapter. And I'd first like to acknowledge all of the people who participated in delivering the chapter. The coordinating lead authors, Jeff Hickey from the US, Simone Lucianello from Mexico, and me, and our lead authors, 26 contributing authors, and our important review editors, and our stellar chapter scientist, Polly. So I'm going to start off and give you three, as we progress through the presentation, three key summary statements from our North America chapter. They're not vetted as and approved by governments as the summary for policymakers statement that I provided to you, but it sort of is the chapeau. This one here is a part of the chapeau statement, 2 paragraphs that we presented at the beginning of the executive summary. And I think I'd really like to share with you this integrated perspective that we provided to the audience. So there's 3 main points, and I'd like to read them to you. Since the AR5, climate change impacts have become more frequent, intense, and have affected many millions of people from every region and sector across North America. Accelerating climate change hazards pose significant risks to the well-being of North American populations and the natural, managed, and human systems on which they depend. Addressing these risks have been made more urgent by delays due to misinformation about climate science that has sowed uncertainty and impeded recognition of risk. The summary statements, this is done a little differently than the previous AR4 and 5. This is much more of an integrated summary or executive summary. So it'll be a little bit more difficult to disentangle some of the ideas and make them stand alone, but I'll try to present with you with some of the key ideas that emanate from this particular statement. So first off, what were the trends and projections that we observed? And so the globe has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we're nearing that 1.5 threshold. For me, there were three ideas of observed extremes that were very interesting. Marine heat waves, and our oceanographer and fisheries biologists identified, they said, marine heat waves from the Baja to Bering, so to the Bering Sea, which to me seemed quite interesting and unique, because I'd always thought about land heat waves. Now we're experiencing marine heat waves in the ocean, with, of course, the knock-on effects with respect to that. The whole idea of atmospheric river phenomena along the West Coast, which of course poor British Columbia experienced this past year, and also the whole idea of hurricanes and heavy precipitation events. For example, the link and the attribution to extreme precipitation associated with intense hurricanes such as Harvey in 2017. So what are some of the projected impacts or extremes that are going forward, so that we need to take account of? The increased frequency of rain on snow events, and also very importantly, the idea of snow droughts and less snow and consecutive years of less snow in Western North America, particularly the mountain areas. And lastly, sort of the recognition that the area, Northeast US, I would also argue Atlantic Canada, at greater risk from severe tropical storms as they expand northward, with rainfall, increased wind speeds, and that slowing landfall of storms, which makes that precipitation events much more significant. The next part I'd just like to share with you is something that we, as an author team, stepped outside our mandated outline, and we added, which we were allowed to do, added another topic area. We felt that we provide a state of the climate system, the hazards, the risks, etc. But we wanted to get a sense of the mood of the people of North America. What is their idea or state of perception of climate change hazards, risks, etc.? We were wrestled with and we're observing that there's a scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change, but polarization remained, and skepticism, etc., in the public and policy domains with respect to climate change. And we did an awful lot of reading and review of papers, and sort of documented that rhetoric, and that there was undermining of the science. And that contributed to uncertainty, a reduction in the sense of urgency and acknowledgement of the risk, and also dissent and contention with respect to the issue of climate change. And some of the literature uncovers some of the factors with respect to that, are sort of things such as vocal groups affect the public discourse and weaken public support, and also political party affiliation and ideology influence that, as well as two other factors. New and emerging, of course, are the echo chambers within the social media, and the tradition of the media using a balanced reporting approach where they give equivalency to ideas which may not be occurring in the actual science itself. So we argued and presented in our chapter that this causes delays in adaptation and mitigation action. The strongest case was developed for the US because there was much more literature, but with our link to the political science and the sociologists, there's also a similar pattern within Canada. This is one of the graphics that we presented, which just to illustrate sort of the distribution of the percent of the population in Canada here is by federal electoral district or riding level, and in the US it's by US congressional district, just to give people a sense of how is the perception of people distributed across North America, represented by US and Canada. And that, of course, within Canada, there's a higher acceptance of climate change than in the US, and that also it's not as clearly evident here, but there's less acceptance of climate change in rural regions than in urban areas. So this is a new piece of information that we introduced in our chapter. And here's another one that was we're quite proud of, and it was led and instigated and led quite exceptionally by Sherry Lee Harper, who really allowed us to have contributing authors, Indigenous contributing authors, to present two sections within the chapter. And it is a reflection of a significant change within the chapter and within the IPCC system to acknowledge these different knowledge systems. And so it became acknowledged that the Indigenous knowledge is another perspective to understand impacts, risks, and develop adaptation actions. And also there was growing demonstration throughout the literature and various sections of the chapter that Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science can work together to co-produce important information with respect to understanding impacts and also the adaptations. But also within our chapter, as written by Indigenous contributing authors, opening our eyes to the Indigenous system of laws and protocols and acknowledging their responsibility-based thinking, which is their cultural paradigm, and that it acknowledges that humans must learn to live with the land. So that's one of the two important advances or changes or new ideas that emanated from the chapter. I'd like to then also share with you the second key statement is that without limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, key risks to North America are expected to intensify rapidly by mid-century. These risks will result in irreversible changes to ecosystems, mounting damages to infrastructure and housing, stress on economic sectors, disruption of livelihoods, and issues with mental and physical health, leisure, and safety. I'll get into that just a little in more detail in the next slide. Another graphic to break up the words here in front of you. I'd like to acknowledge Jackie Dawson from the University of Ottawa and Kirsten Holzman from NOAA, who led this sort of part of the chapter on risk assessment and contributed not only to this particular graphic, but also into other sections of other chapters within the report. The main idea that I'd like to share with you is that this reflects a handshake between Working Group 1, which presented the, pardon me, climate hazards and analyzed those in Working Group 1. And those you will find along the bottom or the x-axis. Along the left-hand side and the y-axis are some of the key risks. And we did a rapid assessment of rapid risk to sort of present an assessment of asset-specific vulnerability and exposure across these various climate hazards. And this was a rapid assessment, which then informed us developing through extensive literature review and a database 10 of our 10 key risks. What I just like to highlight here is sort of the different levels of risk that we've identified relating from undetectable, moderate, high, and very high. And each of those were done by expert judgment, as well as answering some questions such as, is there a very high risk and high confidence in the data and the information and the references? So what are some of our key risks, 10 key risks? I'm just going to list them off. I'd like you to go and look at them in the report. They're a really good sort of integration and synthesis of where we think there are important concerns with respect to North America. And I just like to share with you as sort of how some of those what those are. So the very first key risk that we identified, and I talked about it already, was those divergent or those contested perceptions of climate change. And that poses a risk to adaptation mainstreaming. And from that, sort of the lack of adequate adaptation really influences how society is able to respond to those intensifying extreme events, fires, and storms, which is our key risk too. And then there's the remaining sort of 4 or 5 risks are related to economic and social well-being. You can sort of imagine sort of how hazards affect business or provision of supplies or interruption of economic activity, and that has, of course, social implications as well. There's a really strong component in this particular chapter on the marine social ecological system, really linking together the implications of climate change, not only on fish stocks in the ocean, but then also on aquaculture, for example, and also high value products such as lobster or shellfish, for example. We also address unique terrestrial ecosystems and the services indicating things such as change in forest because of drought and fire to grasslands, for example, and a key risk, of course, of losing forests to forest fires. Freshwater services, particularly in the US Southwest, emerge as a region with really critical issues with respect to fresh water, linking groundwater, surface water, etc. Nevertheless, it is also an issue within Canada when we see the projections indicating a potential reduction in summer flows at a time of high demand. Of course, I've also mentioned the physical and mental health issues. And another one that was not really treated extensively in the AR4 and 5 are the whole idea of food and nutritional security in the far north in Indigenous communities and Inuit communities, as well as Indigenous communities in Mexico and the US. And lastly, but not least, is the idea of the implications. And Jackie Dawson, also from the University of Ottawa, addressed this particular section, was the implications of climate change for commerce and trade. And we all sort of have an appreciation now for supply chain issues and issues with respect to transportation, et cetera, they're linked to weather events, for example. And lastly, our key risk was all of these risks cumulatively interact to really affect and have serious consequences for the quality of life in North America, in their communities, cities, towns, etc. So next I'm going to just highlight two case studies that sort of provide a little bit more of a richer sort of analysis or presentation of some two important issues with respect to climate change within Canada. This one, the first one, is a case study of forest fires, and it's recognized as a really significant or top risk, one of the top risks in Canada from climate change. And so as the climate system is evolving, the anthropogenic climate change has led to warmer and drier conditions, which are conducive to this fire weather is conducive to a longer fire season, and it favors wildland fires. And of course, there's been an increase and an attribution of an increase in area burned to climate change, not only within the general Western North America, but also the I believe it was the 2017 fire season in British Columbia. It was markedly greater because of climate change. One of the key issues with respect to forest fires within Canada and also North America is that wildland human interface, where fires start, occur, and are the reason why we have this particular issue. So I'd like to just sort of make people aware that in Canada, in populated places, 96% of populated places have some kind of interface with wildland urban interface within 5 kilometers. So that's a significant exposure that we need to be aware of. In the chapter, we also use for Canada the 2016 Fort McMurray fire. I'm sure that people can recollect, you know, the disruption to people's lives, livelihoods, economic losses, etc. But I think what we wanted to also mention was that people were very unaware of their high pre-existing fire risk, and papers show that they had limited warning to prepare and leave. So that shows a really significant issue that I think in the broader context we need to start thinking about. What was really interesting was the report of one assessment of the Fort McMurray fire was that it identified that industry, the oil and gas industry, was prepared for fire, and they had actually applied a special, the Fire Smart Canadian tool to improve their resilience. And they suffered, of course, a lot less damages because they had used the tool and assessed their risk and responded and made changes. The Fire Smart tool is also available in Canada. There's also one in the US and Mexico. but some of the research indicates that it's unevenly applied. And it's also, this is where equity and vulnerability and social economic conditions influence the capacity to actually take up and use this knowledge and implement it. The climate change projections, one that I'd like to share with you is that in 2100, the projected area burned increases Canadian fire suppression costs to $1 billion by using RCP 2.6, or 60% increase relative to 1980 to 2009, and 120% increase, or $1.4 billion per year, with the RCP 8.5. And the question that emerges from that, and also the literature that we reviewed, is that will these increases in fire area burned intensity, the potential for severe mega fires, exceed the conventional operational and forest management capacity to respond? And this is something that is quite worrisome, particularly if you think in the North American context, if you have multiple fires, and also because our fire agencies rely on collaborative and supportive use of exchange of firefighters, not only within North America, but around the globe. What is this potential stress on having the capacity to bring people into firefight? The literature and how we report in the chapter is that here is an opportunity, and perhaps more than an opportunity, a need for transformation and a rethinking about how we can coexist with more fire on the landscape, and to think about how we can undertake adaptations that increase ecological and community resilience. So proactive planning for communities and mindful prescribed burns, let's say, to increase ecological health, or selective cutting were some of the examples. The authors, a number of journal articles, identified two approaches or perspectives that would be useful in moving or initiating transformation. And the one is what's called a social ecological perspective. And it thinks about things such as scale or ecosystem complexity, and builds that into land use planning, but also acknowledging and incorporating the perception, capacities, and community values as they develop the adaptations. And also how the institutional arrangements can be modified or improved to support the adaptation. The risk assessment perspective, and I think this perhaps will resonate because it's from a starting point of the short-term reactive fire response framing of how to respond to forest fires, to evolving and changing to a landscape perspective that thinks a bit more long-term in terms of how we might be prepared, not only in the forestry community, but also in communities themselves and on the land, and also how we might prevent problems, and how we can engage the community and practitioners to move forward. The community, so they understand their fire risk and are willing to make changes, and the practitioners who have the opportunity to implement some of those changes. So that's the first case study. And then I'm going to move on to the next one, which is the case study related to sea level rise and adaptation. And here's another complicated graphic. But the intention of this particular box in the chapter was twofold. It wanted to sort of present information from Working Group 1 on sea level rise for a number of communities within North America. And you can see where those communities are located by the numbers associated by the middle, in the middle map along the coastline. And we wanted to use two different sort of emission or future scenarios, and you'll see those as the red and the blue boxes associated with each of the different cities, and they reflect the range of sea level rise that is projected for 2050, 2100, and 2150. We really wanted to communicate to decision makers that sea level rise is an ongoing, evolving risk, and that they need to plan for that. We also wanted to look around the coast of the three coasts of key coasts of North America and identify what was the level of adaptation readiness within various communities around the coasts of North America. And I just wanted to highlight 4 of them, just to identify that we had an assessment process, and the color coding there is reflected as red, no plan, but processes underway, perhaps communications, talk with council. General, the yellow 2 is general climate change plan that mentions sea level rise. Up to number 5, which is a purple specific plan, a progress on actions. And I just wanted to highlight 4 communities. Tuktoyaktuk in the north, it has a plan. There's money identified and available to make some of those adaptations, coastal protection, so there's action. And there's actually some 3 community homes have been retreated, but there's an ongoing conversation for retreat to take place. Halifax has Halifax, it's got a component in it which is both adaptation and mitigation that addresses a very significant coast in Nova Scotia. Surrey, of course, has a plan. It has some funding to actually take some action. And then I think the one that I'd really like to highlight for people is San Francisco has a sea level rise planning process, but most importantly, it has an iterative sea level rise action plan. So it acknowledges that this is an evolving risk, and that once you do an adaptation, you're not done, but you must be continually monitoring and observing and responding to how things change on the ground. So that's that last case study. And now I'd like to sort of talk about adaptation. And this is our final summary statement that I'd like to share with you. And I think I'd like to read it again. Immediate, widespread, and coordinated implementation of adaptation measures aimed at reducing risk and focusing on equity have the greatest potential to maintain and improve the quality of life for North Americans, ensure sustainable livelihoods, and protect the long-term biodiversity, ecological, and economic productivity in North America. And importantly, enhanced sharing of resources and tools for adaptation across economic, social, cultural, and national entities enables more effective short and long-term responses to climate change. So what does that mean? Well, how do we dig down a little bit further into that? So the first sort of is a comment, we tried to do an assessment of adaptation status. Of course, it's a little bit more difficult because a lot of the reports or information is in reports and not so much in journals, and it's difficult to track down. Nevertheless, we made the statement that adaptation across North America is increasing. But a fair bit of it was focused on vulnerability assessment and planning of adaptation strategies and measures. And the action undertaken has really been more gradual, incremental, and I think this is the important idea, is reactive still. We also developed a table that talks about the implementation of adaptations, that there's less of that, and also identified some of the soft and hard limits to adaptation. So for example, soft limits might be financing or legislation or regulation, whereas hard limits, for example, would be erosion and loss of land requiring managed retreats, or loss of cultural and historical resources to fire or sea level rise, for example. So that's the status. We also tried to look at some of the progress and challenges with respect to adaptation. And I just highlight for you some of the measures that we identified that are underway and that are important to build upon and expand. So for example, the idea of integrated climate scenario planning methods. One of our lead authors was using this particular approach to do ecosystem planning and management. It's also extremely relevant to coastal zone management. The idea of climate and ecological forecasting tools, this was brought out in the context of marine, social, ecological systems and fisheries, and how that could be fisheries bycatch, fisheries catch allocations could be improved by ecological forecasting tools. And then of course, as usual, and improving upon and building upon those rapid response systems and early warning systems. The assessment also looked at some of the tools that were merging. So for example, climate risk reporting or insurance and ecosystem management and infrastructure planning, and also infrastructure planning where there is nature-based solutions or a combination of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. One of the key ideas that emerged out of the review was that adaptation is not easy. And it was particularly germane in the assessment by Kathleen Miller on water resources, where she identified and had numerous examples of an initiation of adaptation planning for water security, provision of water, but it's not easy. And it's really difficult to coordinate adaptation implementation across these multiple conflicting interests for water use and also users. And it is extremely expensive in terms of investment and the time to have people do the planning, and also the money spent to do that. It's time consuming. And it's often an under recognized cost, in quotation marks, of adaptation planning and implementation. Lastly, I'd just like to sort of summarize this sort of adaptation is the whole idea of thinking about those interactive, cumulative, and cascading impacts that are going to be a challenge to current adaptation. And just, although it's not in the report, I just would like people to think about what happened in British Columbia. The heat wave with high temperatures, the forest fires, and then the atmospheric river causing flooding and landslides, for example, and interruption of economic activity, transportation. That's an example of interacting, cumulative cascading impacts that we as adaptation planners, thinkers, implementers will have to recognize, because our current practices will become increasingly insufficient to meet those challenges. And that's where we need to start thinking about transformative changes and approaches. So one of the last slides that I'd like to share with you is just an example of what we mean by transformative change. And this definitely emerged out of the whole assessment. Working Group 2 assessment is the whole idea of nature-based solutions. It emerged in the AR5, but it really became evident in this assessment, not only in the summary for policymakers call for more nature-based solutions, but also within our chapter. And to bring forward, it really, nature-based solutions is trying to be transformative. It is thinking about how one might link gray infrastructure with green infrastructure, how we might, for example, green our cities and get those benefits. And so undertaking effective nature-based solutions really requires well-coordinated suite of adaptation efforts. It's a real challenge. We need to do the assessment. We need to do the planning. We have to find the funding. We need people to be willing to take the risk to do something new. And also the challenge of finding ways of doing the implementation and learning from that. And then also, of course, the evaluation and feeding back in. What is also important in this whole particular process is the co-production of this information, new solutions with the stakeholders and across the various sectors, so that you might work with nature-based solutions, not only along the coast, but upriver, where the flow from a river may influence what's happening along the coast, for example. The other idea that emerged in the report was that there are co-benefits, social, economic, environmental, from undertaking these nature-based solutions. But of course, we have to be innovative and willing to take the risk on that. And so they are beneficial because they have the capacity, they being the nature-based solutions, can be self-sustaining and cost-effective, and they may evolve over time and may not decay, such as gray infrastructure, for example. Although in our cities section of the report, there was acknowledgement that while we are undertaking some green infrastructure for flood protection, etc., we really need to be aware and mindful of how this green infrastructure will respond and perform in a changing climate. So lastly, I just would like to talk about adaptation transformation. And it's something that the team, the writing team, the lead authors, and also the contributing authors tried to articulate, although it's of course we rely on the literature, but it was something that we thought was really important to try and articulate. And so what we meant by transformation and how we tried to present it is that it's collaborative, and that we really start, of course, and we are doing this, but forward-looking and integrated planning. But it also, we really are struggling, and we really need to start to move to implementation that reduces risks and increases resilience. And those words were used quite frequently throughout the chapter and in the broader report. And it's I think we're recognizing that there's an issue of integration, integrating across scales and physical systems. So if you're working on coastal erosion, you're acknowledging the coastal cells or the physical units along the coast, or watersheds. You're working on watersheds, you're aware of the watershed itself. Integration across jurisdictions and sectors. So those sort of scale, physical systems, jurisdiction, and sectors, trying to integrate those together. And I think moving from the framing that all adaptation is local, it is not local, because you need to be aware of the larger context within which you're working. And as a broader and growing recognition that you cannot do it alone, that the single homeowner cannot respond to coastal erosion, nor can the municipality. There has to be some kind of alignment and thinking about how we can integrate across that. The last two components, is this came up again numerous times, is that adaptation requires creative funding mechanisms. And not only to pay for implementation, but if we're trying to think about transformation planning, you need to support that. You can't just expect this transformation to happen under the current context and funding envelopes. And then, of course, the challenge of implementation. Lastly, the report, the whole assessment report, was set within the context of sustainability, and it brought out sort of the ideas of how we should be thinking about, along with climate change adaptation, how we think about our land use and land use impacts, our equity and justice, our consumption patterns and our economic activities, all influence how we can respond to climate change. So I'm just going to leave you with my final words. I just would like, and they really are final words. I was thinking about what are some of the key ideas or words that can help us move forward with respect to climate change. And I just thought I'd share these with you, sort of integrated, as I mentioned, across scale, sector, jurisdiction, knowledge systems, aligned in terms of legislation, aligning our capacities to do something, most definitely how we can be collaborative and co-create our solutions, to be creative, to think outside the box, and to be innovative, to innovate and to implement those new solutions. Think about equity and justice, about those who are most vulnerable and who may have difficulty having a place at the table. And of course, the last 3 points is leadership. We need leadership and we need to make decisions. We must be persistent, optimistic, and mostly we must be resilient. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk in black mode here offline to you and to share with you some of the results from our IPCC adventure over the last 3+ years. Thank you very much.
Linda, amazing. In a little over an hour, you took 5 years of work and shared that with us, and for you and the team, a really, really powerful summary, and much appreciated by everybody. Some questions are coming in. Can I remind everybody, I will be collecting your questions and asking them for you the best I can. So please take a moment and send in your questions here for us. I did notice, sorry, just because I'm Paul Kovacs with ICLR, the Executive Director. Just a couple administrative things because I have a moment to do these things and I need to make sure they get done before we run out of time. But we do have 20 minutes to chat with Linda here. So a reminder to everybody, we do this every month, the second Friday of every month. So if people haven't joined us before, please watch, and you get amazing people like Linda to come and talk. Our next one is the second Friday next month, and Henry Sayward of Natural Resources Canada is going to talk about early warnings for earthquakes and the early warning system that's in place in Canada and the work he's been doing for the last 10 years on that. So it's a range of different topics we've been doing over time. There were several questions in the chat. Linda's slides will be shared with you. Also, we have been recording this, so the presentation and the questions will be captured as on the ICLR website and be available. So if you want to go back and review, if you want to tell other people how to come and if they weren't able to be with us today, they can come back and review it. Our website's been really popular for people coming for topics like this one. So all of that will be available to you, and we'll be in touch with you about the details about how all of that comes out. And we're always welcoming of speaker ideas. If people have work you're working on, or you know of somebody like Linda that you would like us to make available to you, we're delighted to play that role. The only thing we require in this is the work has to be completed, and it allows a kind of conversation that's very different than work underway. So I hope that you can share your ideas with us going forward. Linda, I did notice in the chat, Victor Gallant went out of his way to acknowledge what you were sharing from Indigenous voices. That was very unique, and it's often something missing. So the work you did there was recognized here. So thank you and appreciated. Lambork went out of his way to comment that the perceptions work was, again, incredibly important and usually not brought into this sort of format. And so, again, really appreciate it. The first question I saw, as they're now starting to pour in, was from Dan Sandick. And Dan's specific question was at a few points, Linda, he talked about transformational adaptation. Can you just explore that a little bit more? One is that for those of us at ICLR, this is a passion of ours. We love this one. But I'm not sure that everybody has completely defined transformational adaptation. So if you take a moment on that. But do you have a couple examples in Canada or examples that you'd like to share about where you have seen what it is that you are describing as very positive?
Sure. Transformational. Oh my goodness. You're going to make me pull out definition from my mind here. So it really means rethinking, redoing the process. So it's not maintaining the system as it currently exists, which is incremental adaptation, changing small little bits and pieces of the system, but really significantly thinking about how you might really completely change your social system, your response to ecosystem challenges. So it's a whole sweeping change. I hope that helps a bit. Examples. Not an awful lot of them, but I would argue that this beginning to think about and use nature-based solutions. So for example, thinking about using green dikes or wetlands for responding to sea level rise, or in the UK and the Netherlands, thinking about and accepting the fact that you may have to retreat and that you may not be able to protect the coast as you have done in the past. I also sort of alluded to, they're not underway, but the thinking and the idea with respect to forest fire management is not leaving behind, of course, the aggressive reactive response to forest fires. But they're underway is thinking about how we can have more fire on the land and manage around that. One example in our chapter is acknowledging and the knowledge, Indigenous knowledge with respect to forest fires and burns in particular in the American Southwest. So in the past, we have tried to prevent all fires if possible. Now we're trying to think about where we can manage that effectively, but at the same time, think about how we can improve knowledge to communities to prevent and to become more resilient to forest fires. I hope that helped, Dan.
Thank you, Linda. And if I could just sneak in, anybody likes to talk to ICLR about this is a passion of ours. I'm particularly excited about what happened in High River, Alberta, what's happening in British Columbia, and what's happening in Calgary with respect to hail. There are some very exciting Canadian stories that we're looking to share and get talked about more, because there are some great opportunities and great experiences happening.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, to talk about the Great Lakes, it's not underway, but the thinking is thinking about coastal zone management in terms of littoral cells and bringing communities together to think about how we can plan coastal management in a broader context rather than only focusing on groins or seawalls or protecting in front of an individual property, but scaling up and looking across scales and across jurisdictions as well. Thank
you, Linda. I'm going to couple a pair of questions here, and I apologize on the pronunciation. Ursule Boyer-Villemer. One was talking about how to structure adaptation investment, public-private opportunities. And another was challenges for bringing in the socioeconomic science and expertise. Just there's a feeling that engineers and others have been in this space for a while, but how are we doing in North America, in Canada, bringing in the full range of different disciplines to support work in this space?
Well, it's an evolving context, and it also is a reflection, I guess, of transformation that's underway. I mean, we have a focus on built and infrastructure responses in some situations. But I think by recognizing that we need equity and justice, and we need stakeholder involvement and practitioner involvement in integrating that, is moving beyond only a single discipline, but acknowledging that we need multiple disciplines. If we're looking at the landscape level of land use planning or adaptation planning, you have to bring in multiple and many different groups. That is partially why we're recognizing that adaptation planning and implementation is very complex and costly, because we recognize that we need the social, economic, and ecological bringing together of all of these ideas. It isn't cheap, but it's where we need to go. I hope that's addresses the private public funding. It emerges a little bit in the chapter, but not an awful lot. But it's something that is recognized that we need creative financing opportunities. If I can remember correctly, there was one example of coastal protection through coral reefs and wetlands, and innovatively acknowledging that as infrastructure that would receive insurance to be rebuilt if it was affected by an extreme event. So that was a unique private-public funding opportunity.
Wonderful, thank you. I turned my mic off because I have a dog that's full of energy here. I apologize to everybody if he was getting a little boisterous. I have some questions coming from some close friends of yours. So Stuart Cohen, who knows what you are going through, as together you were the lead author previously for an earlier edition. Stuart, thanks you for your presentation. asked you to elaborate a little bit more about misinformation, how this is affecting how climate change adaptation is taking place. But in particular, once you identify this as an issue, what are the thoughts about actions to do? What do you do about misinformation?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart, for the good question, the hard question. The misinformation was a very, very interesting thread to explore. One really good journal paper explored how a particular industry representative had its professional scientists, the reports that they prepared, internal reports, as well as the journal articles that they prepared, and then also in the Times, their editorials and the different examples of what they were saying. So the internal scientific reports and the journal reports all pointed to an acknowledgement that climate change it's anthropogenic, that it deserves to be responded to and have policy responses. The infomercial sort of the advertisements in the Times cast doubt and skepticism on that. Another paper looked at the funding directed by different organizations and how they presented their information. So there were two. There was another one that looked at echo chambers within social media and what was presented in different echo chambers and how far the reach was and what they were speaking about. And that was quite interesting. The misinformation, people who were responsible for that had much broader sort of outreach and communication across different groups. So those are two. The other one was related to media and also that balance and how really trying to provide equivalent space and I guess acknowledgement of recognition of the strength of the argument to two divergent pieces of information. The deniers got equal weight to the people who were the scientists. So that was that. And lastly was sort of the whole idea of casting doubt on some of the professional people doing research on climate change and putting into question their credibility, for example. How that affected, it caused confusion in the public. Who do we believe? If there is so much contested discussion between the experts, who am I to believe? And so certainly there was a questioning of how serious the issue was. It made people uncertain about, do I respond? Do I do adaptation? Is policy needed? And so that was part of the whole question. And also recognizing that people respond to climate change with emotion, with knowledge, and with action. And so if you target and focus on the emotion, it does affect people's capacity to respond. Hope that helps, Stuart.
Wonderful, Linda. Linda, Alain Bork slipped in a question, and in his lovely style, this is a question that could take an hour for you to answer with all of your experience, but we don't have an hour, so you'll have to be a little more succinct, but maybe we'll have a follow-up on this one. Alain said thank you. He also said that many of the people on this call are involved in research in this area. Are there some aspects of scientific research that are being encouraged to get ready for the next assessment report? Are there some specific topics that came up and were identified as priority research questions?
Ooh, Well, I think we talked about it a little bit. How do you get from planning to implementation? I think that is the really underlying question, because we're still seem to be stuck more on the problem definition rather than on the solution space. So how does one still improve the adaptation process to get to implementation? I also alluded to, how do you finance these things? How do you improve the capacity of people to undertake this transformative change through finances and knowledge and implementation? Is that succinct enough?
You did wonderfully, Linda, as you always do. I'm going to take one question out of order. A moment ago, when you were answering Stuart, Cindy jumped in and Cindy Seifeld jumped in and said, you mentioned 3 things when you answered Stuart: emotion, action, and what was the third one?
Knowledge.
Knowledge. Thank you. Excellent. Next question was from Don Lemon.
Oh, no.
Don, again, it's a longer question. I'll again apologize, Don, for being a little short here with the time. Don talks about climate resilient development pathways. Did that come up during the work? How's that going? Is that being embraced in North America? Are there, anyway, the climate resilient pathways, some of the thinking about that?
Thanks, Don. You know, it has much more prevalence in other sections of the report and less so in our chapter. And I don't know if that's a reflection of the literature or the people who were writing the section. I would argue that perhaps, to answer Elaine's question too, that is another important research question. What is our pathway? I mean, there's a graphic which you will laugh about this sort of decision space, but that climate resilient pathways is also part of the way you think about how we are going to evolve and transform over time.
Linda, you're wonderful. I've got 2 more questions. We've got 5 minutes left because I need to promise to wrap up here. I have one from Sherry Young, one from Keith Porter. Gordon might sneak one here at the end. I see he might be ready to go because he often does. Sherry Young's question was very succinct. Can we insure natural assets?
I don't know. No, I don't know. I really don't. Well, didn't I acknowledge that there was the coral reef? That was one example in our chapter, which was insured if it was destroyed during a hurricane or extreme event, that it would be rebuilt, because that was a coral reef that was improved or added to with time as an adaptation. So I hope I'm showing that's one of the areas that I'm not quite so sure on. So sorry about that.
Thanks, Linda. And if Sherry and others would like to connect, there's insurers who are usually willing to insure anything. It's working out the details and making sure everybody's satisfied. And I think, as you were sharing, Linda, there's not a lot of examples.
No.
But the question is it possible? The answer is yes, and there are some examples.
Well, that's, again, I guess, the challenge for innovative financing and adaptations, right?
Excellent, thank you. Keith Porter's question was very much in the same space as Stuart Cohen's. I'll see if I can find a way to differentiate a little bit, but again, thanks for the comments about climate denial. What untapped opportunities do you see about making progress overcoming political opposition to adaptation that comes from climate denial?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, this is an example of 14.3 being problem definition, more and less on the solution space. And it was more trying to get our heads wrapped around what this problem actually is. There were a couple of ideas that emerged as communicating. There was one US study by Christ et al. That looked at sectioning the community and communication to different groups, the worried, the accepting, sort of targeting your messages to the characteristics of the group that you want to respond to. I think also that's why collaborative and co-creation is really important. There were some examples of one sea level rise situation that brought together different groups of people, all the way from like archaeologists to fisheries people. And I think in that co-creation and that collaborative environment, it helps overcome the denial, or also acknowledges that brings people together to acknowledge that there are solutions that they need to work together on. Because part of the denial is that uncertainty, that questioning, and if you can start to work on solutions, I think that helps bring people together. And you also have to recognize that you will not be able to reach all people. You must reach the ones that you can reach and move forward with that. And slowly, still incrementally gather people around the table to address the issue of climate change.
Thank you, Linda. Gordon, we're out of time, so you're going to do a really short question, and Linda, a short answer, and then I'll do a thank you, and we'll wrap up for everybody. Gordon?
All right, thank you very much. The great presentation, Linda. This is a quick, well, anyway, we have created a Canadian Association of Professionals in Climate Change, which is being announced shortly or being more publicized. Elaine Burke, who's been on this show, is one of the other participants on the board of directors, which I happen to chair. But I guess one of the things I was going to ask in this whole question of denial and things, and the bringing together across the disciplines, we could see an opportunity for an association of that, of professionals, and we've been all disciplines, lawyers, accountants, etc., to come together to address the issues of climate change. Ian Burton's another member of our team. So anyway, we've got a dozen board members now, and we'll be talking about this further, but I just, do you think there's an opportunity here? And we can talk about this further after we get offline, but anyway, any quick comments?
Most definitely. Two things. I think collaboration and bringing together different disciplines is crucially important, and having people who can sort of help guide or a place where we can congregate is really important. The other thing is I've been doing a series of interviews on coastal management, and all of the interviewees say it would be wonderful for an opportunity where I can meet with like-minded people to talk about the issue of climate change adaptation. And one person so jokingly said, sort of like a dating app service, but for adaptation.
Oh, okay.
So
we'll
yeah.
see about that one.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, my role's to wrap up here. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. We had a great turnout, and because you wanted this session, we were able to put it on. So thank you for suggesting this session and for taking the time to be here. Linda, amazing. Thank you for your service over many years. This is a task that doesn't get the thanks that you deserve and you've earned, and you've represented us so well. Thank you so much. Taking all of this work and getting into this short space and being available to talk to us about it, you know, just a week after the report came out. So thank you for this, Linda. Greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure, and it's part of the passion to talk to other people about the issue of climate change and climate change adaptation. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everybody. Keep well, keep healthy.
Thank you.